I will give some opening remarks for the session. Okay, first of all, let's start this reflection recognizing that there are different types of infrastructure. When we started planning and discussions around this session, we wanted intentionally to not just address the gray or hard infrastructure, but we also wanted the opportunity to talk about the green infrastructure and nature-based solutions, and also digital infrastructure. This will be the framework of the discussions of resilient infrastructure. Something else that's important is the dual role that infrastructure has, not just for reduction of disasters. We have two examples of Latin American countries where they have infrastructure for preventing flooding. But another thing that's essential, infrastructure should also be resilient to disasters. So not just infrastructure to reduce risk, but also infrastructure to be functional to the occurrence of disasters. We have the earthquake of Ecuador, and then we have rains in Medellin, Colombia. In both cases, we have a loss of functionality of infrastructure. And then to wrap up initial or opening remarks, the inequality gaps. Infrastructure plays an essential role in reducing the inequality gaps. Access to public services, access to transportation, access to education, but also an environment where we have tried to reduce to the minimum the risk of disasters. We have a picture of the city of Panama. There's something important here. Latin America is the most unequal region of the world. That's just statistics. And so we need to find out how infrastructure can help us to reduce this gap. With those opening remarks, I'm going to give the floor to our next speaker. We have Paula Albrito here. We have the honor of having her here.
You good? Okay, oh, that's perfect. So, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, a pleasure to be with you today to tackle and discuss this very important dimension. The summary of the Regional Assessment Report on Disaster Risk in the Americas and in the Caribbean have identified that disaster losses are having a major impact in our development. Concurrent to this is the new and emerging pattern in the region that continues to grow. With the rapidly increasing risk of climate change and far-reaching systemic hazards like the global pandemic, many critical infrastructure services are exposed to be increasingly vulnerable. Critical infrastructure underpins our quality of life and social well-being because of the provision of essential services in a wide range of sections, from health and social care to education, transport, energy, telecommunication, public safety, security, and of course, emergency services. As we look across the landscape of the region, we have seen that risk management governance remains mostly reactive, and investments into resilient infrastructure is not yet embedded in our DNA. The Regional Assessment Report in 2021 highlighted that Latin America remains the most unequal region in the world in terms of income distribution. Urban population continues to grow with significant environmental degradation. If the present trend continues without the integration of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, both disaster risk and impact of disasters will increase. Critical infrastructure systems, such as health, education, energy, transportation, and water, now serve more people than ever before. Recent multi-hazards events around the world have highlighted potential vulnerabilities and exposure in our infrastructure systems. As such, it is fundamental that the development of our critical infrastructure is done adequately through investments in resilience. Target D of the Sendai framework focuses on sustainability, substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services, among them health and education facilities, including through developing their resilience by 2030. This means that member states should have updated evidence-based regulatory framework, policy and strategy that can support the contextual challenges that exist. However, in order for this to take place, we must first understand the concept of resilient infrastructure and what it entails. The United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has recognized this gap and is therefore working with member states, with all of you, in order to improve their infrastructure resilience. With partners from governments and industry, UNDRR has developed principles for the resilient infrastructure to help stakeholders better understand what infrastructure resilience entails, and to ensure that resilience is embedded into infrastructure decision and investment. These principles are now being translated into a handbook for implementation that provides practical guidance for increasing infrastructure resilience, as well as key indicators to assess national performance and identify priority action. Additionally, to help governments implement a key action of the principles, UNDRR has developed a resilient infrastructure stress test tool. In developing this important tool, we are looking at identifying vulnerabilities in infrastructure system which are not visible under normal operation. It also allows countries to gain a better understanding of the interdependencies between infrastructure systems by shedding lights on the cascading impact of failures in some part of the infrastructure system. UNDRR Regional Office is now bringing this work to the region and is engaged on implementing the principles for resilient infrastructure and the stress test tool in 3 countries where the partnership has been moving ahead: in Costa Rica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Panama. We thank those countries for their willingness to engage in this initiative to increase the level of resilience of the critical infrastructure, and very much looking forward for working with other partners in the region as well. Let me finish by stressing that one of the main targets of the Sendai framework is to substantially reduce disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of the basic services. This required a mindset shift from focusing on managing disasters to prioritizing prevention and ensuring resilience that is embedded into the whole infrastructure system. At UNDRR, we stand ready to collaborate with countries and with partners in the region to accelerate progress towards a resilient infrastructure, which is key for achieving national sustainable development goals and the future of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, doctora Albitrio. La presentación que acabamos de escuchar, digamos, el discurso inaugural.
We just heard this opening speech, I think, gathers the main elements that we want to transmit in this session, and especially saying that infrastructure, particularly the vision of resilient infrastructure, is one of those areas where we are really evolving the most to adapt to climate change and developing principles that can be applied globally, especially with the 3 countries that are in the beginning pilot. But also there's a key message in this speech, which is that there are urgent targets, which is focusing on critical infrastructure. This will increase the well-being of our communities, but these are also essential in the recovery post-disaster. So again, thank you very much for being here. Dr. Paula Albitrio has to go elsewhere to go to a high-level meeting, so thank you very much for being here. Okay, then we'll continue with our next panelist. He is he joined remotely We will have a video, but he will be available as well for Q&As at the end. He is Omar Dario Cardona. He has a great trajectory. He's been working in risk management, disaster risk management. He's civil engineer. Again, he's also a teacher of disaster risk management and climate change adaptation at the Institute of Environment Studies at the National University of Colombia. He is also a founder of Ingeniería Rayado, which is a company many of you may know. He has been the director of the disaster risk management in Colombia from 92 to 95, president of the Colombian Association of Earthquake Engineering, and in 2004, he was awarded the UN Sasakawa Prize for his contributions to global disaster risk assessment and management. And so without further ado, let's play the video that Dr. Omar Dario has, and then we'll proceed to Q&As. Okay? Thank you very much for this kind invitation. In this presentation, I will talk about modeling of risk of the infrastructure and the GIRI Global Resilience Index, which is being developed right now in the framework of the Coalition for Disaster Reduction, which includes many countries now. And so GIRI is a metric, and it's a conceptual framework to the modelation of risk and resilience of infrastructure systems, which support the socioeconomic activities of the countries. This index takes into account or talks about the risk of disasters based on metrics or on probabilities of metrics, and incorporates climate change. It also takes into account variables of socioeconomic context, which, of course, have an impact on the performance of each country. So this is an index that is based on the performance that each country has, considering several capacities that can be reflected based on indicators associated to three main components. The first of them is the ability to anticipate and absorb, which is also linked to resistance and sturdiness of systems. A second component, which is the ability to prepare and respond, which is associated to effective reaction and to redundance, for example. And then the third component associated with the ability to recover and adapt, which is linked to quick rehabilitation and restoration when a disaster happens. From a technical point of view, we use what today we know as resilience concept in infrastructure. We have a level of performances in infrastructures that can be affected by the impact of events. And the drop of that performance depends on the ability to absorb the impact of the infrastructure. And we can see this evaluating the risk that the infrastructure has. And there are several indicators that talk about the impact of that potential loss or damage or loss of functionality in a social context. In a degraded state post-event, that's when the response to the emergency is manifested, response to the crisis. And so there are several indicators that also talk about the ability to respond facing that situation before the efforts for restoration, which is associated to the ability that they have to restore with several indicators or to recover the functionality and performance of those infrastructures to their original state or even a better condition. If we take into account these three main components and this graph here, we can then get an indicator which takes into account the area. The area that we could gather with the three metrics that I talked about. Additionally, we have considered threats such as earthquakes, tsunamis, landslides, floodings, tropical cyclones, and drought. And so we have incorporated the effect that climate change has in many of these threats that may even further or deepen the situation. But we also see what's the impact of these threats in multiple sectors: energy, roads, transportation, airports, facilities, dealing with water, oil, telecommunications, or education, health, and others. We all well know the risk modulation. We see the threat and vulnerability of exposed elements. In this case, it would be infrastructure. These threats can be deepened, as I mentioned, by climate change. And so we can get the metrics of risk, which are widely known, annual loss or probable loss. And so this is how we get to that index that I've been talking about. When looking at all the studies, for example, of seismic activity or the assessment of tsunamis as well, the studies that we have performed with climate change, floodings for all of the countries, or the potential effects that tropical cyclones may have, and taking into account the exposition, meaning the infrastructure of all the sectors that I just mentioned, and in each of the countries considering the database that exists for this at international level, well, we have assessed with several archetypes the different components of architecture, meaning the infrastructure is divided into subcomponents. And each of these infrastructures have taken into account the curves of vulnerability, of physical vulnerability that may be associated to each component, considering different threats: earthquake, flooding, tsunami, cyclones, etc. And so we have obtained the result of, for example, the risk loss for earthquakes, for cyclones, for floodings, for tsunamis. And we have also been able to do all this at subnational level in each of the countries. We have Chile here, and so we see the different probability of the country that may be affected by earthquake, or in this new image, this is in the event of floodings for different subnational divisions. And so that's how we got the Gini index of resilience for each of the countries. And basically, the purpose has been to provide a general overview of resilience so that we can benchmark and compare a ranking of the countries. This is important because it incorporates the risk for events that haven't happened yet. We have taken into account statistics and historical events. It goes from global to local, meaning we use the same method for all of those, and this promotes, or this encourages countries to perform assessments of risk with better resolution. Okay, thank you very much. And I hope that this type of information is useful for what will be developed in the future in Latin America and the Caribbean.
Vale, no. Muchas gracias, profesor Omar Darío. Es en realidad un reto.
Professor, it's hard to summarize all the key messages of this presentation, but maybe I wanted to share with you that this type of work summarize something that's important, which is learning in risk management. We can see here how we have changed our conceptual approach of risk management, but then adding the critical infrastructure concept that we had reflected on after the first speech, and how we make efforts to measure the different stages of risk management after disasters, especially in critical infrastructure. But there's an additional layer of learning, which is how climate change is interacting with these different threats and how we reflect that conceptual learning into common metrics that help in decision making. And so this presentation, of course, we wanted to be part of the first panelist to set the tone of how we in Latin America and the Caribbean in particular have approached understanding, measuring, and supporting decision-making in risk management with this type of infrastructure. I'm sure many of you have questions. At the end, we will have space for that. But I want to share the Slido tool, slido.com, which has been available throughout the entire event. So if you can maybe take a picture and log in to slido.com with the code 1918363. I'll be taking a look into that. Next speech will be by Kevin Douglas. He is a disaster risk and natural resource management practitioner. He has over 10 years of experience designing and executing projects, especially in coastal landscapes. We will talk about his experience working in ecosystems and communities that are vulnerable in the coastal regions. He works right now with a project that is co-funded by Nature Conservancy and the Red Cross in Jamaica. He is participating virtually, and so go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It is indeed my pleasure to be here. The focus of the presentation is on building resilience of green infrastructure as well as processes, particularly at the local community level. I want to highlight our partnership between the Red Cross movement and the Nature Conservancy, implemented both a community-centered as well as a scientific process to improve the resilience of green infrastructure. And the focus of the Resilient Islands project was particularly at the local community level. There is sometimes a view that resilience building approaches can't be scientifically sound and the community centered at the same time. There's a view that one has to give way to the other, but this is simply not true. We can have sound scientific based implementation, which are also community led and community centered. Next slide, please. The Resilient Islands project is a partnership between the Nature Conservancy, which is the world's largest conservation organization, and the Red Cross movement, which is the world's largest humanitarian organization. So it's one that trumpets that resilience building must equally include science as well as the people being affected by whatever it is that we're trying to build resilience to, which in our case in the Caribbean is the varying climate-induced and other hazards which are really wreaking havoc on the people and our economies. Next slide. The Jamaica Red Cross and the Nature Conservancy and partners ensured a community-centered process in building resilience through very patient and sustained community engagement, which is absolutely key to ownership and sustainability of initiatives. So we took the approach that the time has to be taken to engage the local communities. These were the persons who are being most impacted or being most affected who are facing the brunt of the storms and all the other climate-induced hazards. And so engaging these local persons and having them at the center of any resilience building action is very, very critical. And so we took the time to engage the community and to have them being centered in this approach. Next slide. These are just a few photographs of some of our engagement strategies. Right, so in addition, next slide, please continue. In addition to the engagement of local communities, a firm scientific base was also laid through rigorous assessments and scientific research, which were still able to have the community being centrally involved. So it's a mixture of people-centered approaches as well as scientific approaches. Now, when one merges, next slide. All right, so as I said, there are people-centered approaches on community ownership and sustainability, which is absolutely critical. Now, out of the community-led approaches, continue please. Next slide. Yes, continue. Out of the community-led and scientific process of the Resilient Islands project emerged green infrastructure and other solutions for building community resilience. And so these resilience building initiatives, though we had the scientific experts to look at undertake these assessments and carry them out, but also the community played a critical role in that. And so what emerged out of this, for example, is that we developed a suite of nature-based solutions, based on the various assessments undertaken with the community and with experts that will, when implemented, will look at building the resilience at the local community, level. We have commenced implementation of testing, for example, and so one of those which would have emerged along the coastline, because the community in which we're working is the largest fishing community in Jamaica, and so mangrove restoration, for example, would be a key nature-based solution which would have emerged from that. And working together with partners, we have started that implementation, as well as there are several other initiatives which would have come forward in the suite of nature-based solutions, which will significantly build the resilience at the local community level. And once the community has ownership of this process, then it argues better for the sustainability. Additionally, the processes and the outcomes and actions have been accepted both by decision makers and critically by the local community level. One example I can share is that we partnered, for example, with our local National Disaster Office to carry out assessments or ranking of vulnerable communities. And so we worked with the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management to develop a tool which now incorporates ecosystems as one of the critical criteria. Before this partnership, the health of ecosystems was not a major factor considered when looking at ranking communities. And so the government of Jamaica, through the National Disaster Office, would have accepted this. And so now when looking at ranking communities, the health of the ecosystems and the value that nature plays in the realm of reducing disaster risk is now a firm part of the government action. Additionally, as we train and build capacity among our own staff and volunteers, we also do the same thing to our government partners. And so what it means is that the methodology, the process, and the way of doing things in highlighting the value that nature plays in the risk reduction landscape has been accepted. And of course, very importantly, and even most important, is that the local community, which are the owners of the resources, which are the ones who are being impacted, they too have accepted their role in preserving the natural environment, in restoring degraded ecosystems, which leads to their own reduction of their own risks. And so we have been able, through this community-led partnership approach, to significantly reduce the risks being faced by local communities. And additionally, we have now replicated this approach, this process, in 2 other communities under an additional project known as the Greening Red Cross and Red Crescent Disaster Risk Reduction process. And so we have now transferred and we're working in the upland watershed communities. So therefore, this methodology, this process is one that is transferable and is one that is able to be replicated. And we are seeing the success of that still with the community at the center, but also having a very firm scientific base. And so we believe that this approach is one that can be copied, and there are significant lessons to be learned from that. And the Red Cross movement and the Nature Conservancy have certainly learned these lessons, and we are putting them into practice. And with the support of local communities and government and other stakeholders, we have seen the success of this, and we continue to learn and to adjust our approach. Thank you for your time, for listening.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I would like to, yo quisiera reflexionar sobre la diapositiva que
to reflect on the slide that was the longest on the screen, which has an important message, which is also a learning opportunity. You saw that these were people with the Red Cross uniform restoring mangroves. This reflects learning how an organization such as the Red Cross, which is a humanitarian organization, evolved into this integral vision of risk management to work on preparation, on risk reduction, and also with their reconstruction and response systems. But this also reflects how we have learned that nature-based solutions are important, and how working with the communities, recovering and maintaining the ecosystems, we can help reduce the risk. In this case, these were disasters, of course, that are usual in these areas, which are floodings and storms. But there's a lot of learning behind this. And a message that's important for this session is how we must empower communities, how to come up with infrastructure projects that go beyond physical infrastructure, but also thinking about green infrastructure, this new term that I believe has a positive message, which is nature-based solutions. Now we have our next panelist, Nigel Munoz. Nigel is also participating virtually. He's an infrastructure and project management specialist with over 20 years of experience managing and developing various types of infrastructure projects. He has worked for over 10 years with UNOPS, UNOPS. And so, Nigel, please, you have the floor. Hi, thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Today, it is my pleasure to talk a bit about what we call inclusive infrastructure for climate action. Maybe we can share the slides, please. Thank you. Okay, so as we have heard from the different events, when we talk about resilient infrastructure, we must talk about climate change. We know that this has massive changes, massive impacts, floodings, storms, and this impacts the economies of the countries. This is generalized, it is fast, and it's intensifying as we speak. The crisis and perturbations in the climate have, of course, harmed the infrastructure and their ability to serve the communities, especially those communities who are underserved. Countries have witnessed the socioeconomic changes directly derived from climate change, and how this has increased the gaps in our communities, and of course it has hindered the sustainable development of the countries. Next slide, please. with the goal of helping local and national governments framing this issue. In 2021, we launched the report which talked about the importance of climate change in infrastructure. We worked with UNOPS and the University of Oxford. And so we now know that 79% of emissions, of greenhouse emissions, come from infrastructure. And so we cannot think about climate change without infrastructure, and vice versa. Let's remember that infrastructure is at the center of all ODS, of all sustainable development goals. And so to not make the same mistakes from the past and really tap into the opportunities that we have, we need to have an integral goal. We need to recognize that the planet has limited resources and that human activity must respect the environmental limitations so that we can protect humanity. This development is at the intersection of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. Next slide, please.
Ahora, dando un paso más allá.
Now, going a step further in our efforts, in November of last year, UNOPS launched Inclusive Infrastructure for Climate Action. These were researches done from September 2021 and November 2022. This research was done in partnership with several organizations working with different communities across the world so that we could assess what infrastructure services do communities need on a day-to-day basis. Needs now, or this reflected that vulnerable communities have the least services and they have a hard time satisfying their own needs. This, of course, affects quality of life and also resilience when facing disaster. Next, please. But what do we mean by inclusive infrastructure? We defined it as that infrastructure which takes into account the diverse needs of all people, especially those marginalized communities, and it empowers them so that they can have a good quality of life, so that they can engage fully with society and be more resilient to the effects of climate change. As a result of this research, we have an inclusive approach for the development of infrastructure, and I will talk about that further. Next, please.
Siguiente, gracias.
Next slide. Thank you. So we started exploring the 9 social groups and their experiences, intersectional experiences regarding the services of infrastructure. These groups are not thorough and they don't include the entire population, but we found between 81 and 88% of all global population. That's why we decided to include them in inclusive infrastructure. Next slide, please. Then we identified the main systematic barriers that these groups face. And so we see here, it's discrimination and social exclusion, physical obstacles and lack of security, lack of access to information and lack of access in decision making, and of course, costs. And so we defined 5 principles in the development of inclusive infrastructure. First principle is equity, which wants to provide equal access to infrastructure, also accessibility, access to users, or thinking about users and not thinking about the infrastructure, affordability, so that all people can access good quality services that are affordable, and then no harm rule to not expose people to social, economic, or physical negative effects that may come from infrastructure or climate change. And then the last one is empowering, the principle of empowering, which wants people to make informed decisions and sustainable decisions regarding their lives, and of course, tackle climate situations in their communities. Next slide, please. And then at the end of this research, we came up with 24 recommendations, specific recommendations that were grouped in 7 areas. The first area would be incorporation of inclusion and empowering of the users. Then we have advancing capacity of stakeholders to achieve inclusion, then a gathering of data centered in people, promotion of a reform of institutional frameworks, planning and design to all, innovation in institutional models, and also support of initiatives in favor of transparency. Next, please. Now, the report also included a guide to implement all the recommendations according to the stage of the infrastructure and the main stakeholders that need to support this to achieve these goals, so that inclusive infrastructure can be successful. It also has some success cases and some study cases in different infrastructure, communications, water, etc. Next slide, please. I'll take a pause here before the end. This is a sentence for you to reflect. I encourage you to build a future that leaves no one behind. That's it from me. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Nigel. Un poco también para poder tener...
Nigel. So that we can have some time at the end for some Q&As, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Salinas, Victoria Salinas. No, over here. Victoria works for the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency.
She is the
And
senior official performing the duties of Deputy Administrator for Resilience. Lo que en español sería como la administradora encargada de resiliencia dentro de FEMA. Sí, vale. Sí.
Buenos días, ¿cómo están todos?
good morning. How are you?
¿Están bien el último día? Bueno,
Okay, this is the last day. You're well. The speech will be in English, but in the Q&A, I will answer in Spanish. And I hope there are some questions.
how we scale up resilient infrastructure. And that really gets to how we use our governance. It gets to issues of policy, public policy, regulation, good practices, innovation. Building resilient infrastructure is not just about that infrastructure and its ability to withstand and adapt and bounce back from hazards. It's ultimately about people and whether the infrastructure systems that surround us, that support our daily lives, either hinder or hurt our ability, our community's ability to be resilient to the shocks, to the stresses that we're experiencing and that we know are only increasing. So in essence, infrastructure can be a driver of resilience. It can also be a chronic stress. In the United States, our aging infrastructure and our historic underinvestment in infrastructure in low-income communities and things as simple as stormwater management systems has led to a situation where disasters have a disproportionate impact on Black, Brown, Indigenous, and rural communities, something we're rectifying now. Each of us in this room has tools to help drive resilient infrastructure. And at FEMA, as a federal agency that is in charge of disaster risk management, We have a lot of different tools at our disposal in the executive branch. Policies, regulation. We don't make the laws, but we give recommendations to Congress on how to fix laws so we can do our job better. So we help create an enabling environment to support both the soft, the hard, the green, the blue, the gray infrastructure that ultimately serves communities so they can be more resilient to everything. So because we're all practitioners, I'm going to share several concrete things we're doing to try and realize this vision. First is around policy. The Biden and Harris administration signed into law billions and trillions of new dollars that are going into infrastructure through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. A historic watershed moment for our nation. And so what we're doing on the policy side is taking a whole of government approach to really integrating risk reduction into all of the grant programs that are executing those dollars and resulting in changes in communities. Risk reduction, cybersecurity, all of those things that go into all hazards approach to resilience are being woven into the programs that are funded through this historic legislation. In FEMA, I'll give you that concrete example as I oversee resilience in FEMA. We're using our grants to encourage those policy priorities. Our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant, one of our flagship programs, last year was $2.3 billion that we were giving out to communities. We prioritized nature-based solutions in the way we did points. We made sure that projects and programming was going to building capacity building. Partnerships and having meaningful partnerships was something we prioritized in points. Everything from serving this, if a project served underserved communities better, if it was enforcing building codes, all of those things we've been incentivizing through the policies we put into place that manifest in our grants. We're also making sure that we're keeping up with the basics. Building codes save lives. And it may be a surprise to many of you, but in the United States, only 35% of our communities have adopted the latest building codes. And as you know, research shows in the US, for instance, $1 in building codes is $11 of future avoided loss. And so when we look at the future and we look at the next 30 years, hazard-resistant building codes are projected to prevent $132 billion in losses over that time period. And so we're working hard both through our national strategy on building codes, FEMA's own approaches to building codes, to really incentivize behavior change there. I must admit, I was envious yesterday when my colleague from Guatemala shared that they were able to do their municipal building codes. And I believe he was speaking from the federal level, being able to do municipal building codes. Our governance structure in the US doesn't permit that. It's a local decision. And so we have to use behavioral science to really get states to adopt. We can encourage, we can penalize, but because we know that as a foundational thing of a resilient infrastructure, resilient communities, we continue to look at how we use BRIC and other programs to really get higher adoption and meet some of our national goals, around 50% of adoption in the next couple years of building codes. Regulatory change. That's something else that we do in the executive branch. And I'll give you one example of how we are taking science and really using regulations to take a whole of government approach to flood risk management. We have the Biden administration called for really making sure that we were taking a national approach to climate resilience and flood risk reduction. And so we've been working to implement the federal flood risk management standard. And essentially this executive order of policy has resulted in all the departments and agencies looking at how they can implement that. And at FEMA, it's a mix of policy and regulation to really ensure that every federal investment, whether it's a building that the government sits in or it's a project that government dollars are going into, is taking the latest science, either climate science informed approach to what they're doing with that infrastructure and those projects, or they're setting a standard such as a freeboard value approach so that there's specific types of elevation that are taking place with those projects, or they're using a 50-year floodplain management approach. There's some flexibility there, but the point is taking a science-based approach so that that concept of a community resilient from flood risk is pervasive in a whole of government way. And it takes time. Regulatory processes in the United States are more than 20 steps long and take multiple years. And so it is a time and investment over many, many, many months to get these things in place, but the impact is deep and long-term. The fourth area I wanted to share was around data. And we saw in the first presentation how powerful data can be. In the United States, we've made some really strong advances in getting granular risk information into the hands of communities. This past year alone, FEMA, in partnership with the telecom company AT&T and Department of Energy's Argonne National Labs, published the online climate risk and resilience portal. Downscaled climate data for 2030, 2050, 2080 at the 14-kilometer level. Soon it'll be 4 kilometers. That allows neighborhood level planning, and it brings into it GIS information from some of our other resilience analysis tools that look at demographics. Where's the critical infrastructure? It really enables local planners to think about the resilience of their entire infrastructure system in service of the people and the demography they serve. Similarly, we brought together another portal that couples that with resources. But the challenges continue to be real, and I'll end with the challenges. Governance. We're talking about bringing different systems together, different sectors together to ensure we have resilient infrastructure systems. And that continues to be a challenge for all of us. We don't have the answer here. We know it's a must, but I think as long as there's been more than 2 people on this planet, we know that silos have existed, and we haven't cracked the nut on how to dismantle those silos so we can have the systemic solutions, the collaboration, the partnerships, not just because we know each other, but because the governance system that brings us all together is systematic, consistent, and delivers those results of a resilient community and a resilient nation each of us is pushing forward to every single day.
Muchas gracias, Victoria.
Thank you very much, Victoria. In an effort to be on schedule, we will only take 2 questions. One of them will be for Omar Dario Cardona, and then the other one for Victoria. While Omar Dario prepares, let's start with Victoria. It's in English. I will read it in Spanish. The question is, what is the best approach to plan resilient infrastructure, both in the context of recovering post-disaster, but also involving the private sector? Maybe we haven't talked about that, which is how to include the sector. Location is super important because this type of partnership happens in specific places. What we're doing, what we're seeing is that to be able what we need post-disaster, but also pre-disaster, is to work locally with private sector and, of course, with the government. What just happened in the U.S., which is that we have a new law, Community Disaster Resilience Zone. This allows FEMA to use all the data that we have available, so that in July we can establish all the zones down to the smallest census, assess the vulnerability so that we work with all agencies, and this includes private sector, philanthropy, so that work, and in 5 years advance as quickly as we can. That type of infrastructure will allow us to create this governance, which I mentioned we're lacking. That's our challenge. But localizing the issue, having different organizations together, looking at the same problem, at the same issue, and the same understanding of risk, this will take us further. Thank you very much. And now we have a question for Omar Dario Cardona. It's a long question. In the audience, they're interested to know how long did it take to come up with this GD index, but also how did you look into the information? What were your sources of information, and how can we know better how you calculated, the metrics of the infrastructure, and at the end, How long did it take for you to calculate this index, the Cheery index?
Bueno, gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you for the question. It is a long one, yes. This is a subject that would take a long time to answer to each one of those questions or each part of that question. But we have a lot of information. It's just very dispersed. And so we had to get global databases where we have, of course, we have many sources. I cannot go into detail, but there will be a report that will be soon published. We've spent about a year and a half in this process. It is a consortia of different institutions. We have people from Norway, from Switzerland, from Italy, from India. And we are making a great effort so that this tool is available for all countries. What cannot be measured cannot be managed. I cannot manage risk if I don't know what's the risk. So we have a global effort so that we can have a country and sector vision and multi-threat vision of the risk. At the end, what we want is for countries to really looking into their threats in detail and see the great importance of supporting those infrastructures that provide services for the community. And not just gray infrastructure, the green infrastructure and the blue infrastructure, as was just mentioned as well, and a work of systemic interinstitutional work is key, because we cannot disaggregate these issues. This needs to be really a whole problem and a whole approach.
Hola, vale. Yo creo que esta respuesta
I
resume.
believe this answer really summarizes the conclusions of this panel. It would be wrong for me to add something else. I just wanted to thank all of you for your participation. We only went over 2 minutes after schedule. So please give a great round of applause for our panelists and our speakers. Thank you. Thank you for being here.